So, because I decided it'd be way easier for you to remember questions, not having to read what I wrote on the board, but print it up, I printed up what the questions will be. But don't look at the questions till we get to that particular part. So tonight we're going to talk about Abraham and Sarah, who start off as Abram and Sarai, but I will always forget that, so just forgive me. I'm going to call them Abraham and Sarah throughout. Why are they significant? Abraham is the father of the faith for Jews, Christians, Muslims, right? So all three of us count Abraham as the father of faith. But what we sometimes forget is Sarah's a huge part of that, right? Because he could have had children with other women. He actually does, and that could have been the lineage, but it's not. Sarah becomes fundamental to that process. What I think is kind of interesting about this is, one, he's extremely wealthy, and what did most wealthy people have back in the day? Multiple servants, wives.
Concubines.
Well, he had servants.
Right.
He doesn't appear to have concubines, which is interesting for a very wealthy man. He doesn't have other wives, which is, once again, interesting for how wealthy he would be. We know he's wealthy because it talks about how when God gives him the call, saying, get up and go to a land I will serve you, it says he brought his men and servants with him, i.e. he had a collection of humanity that went with him. While poor folk like Joseph and Mary get a donkey, right? If they're lucky. Everyone else. So this guy's a wealthy guy, but he still only has one wife. But at the same time, and I think this becomes important in love stories, is we have a tendency to really focus on love stories are always positive and great, right? Not so though, right? They usually have some pretty horrible things. Guess what? Sarah and Abram have some really dreadful things that happen in their relationship. So the first thing we're going to actually talk about is one of those dreadful stories, and it's in Genesis 12, 10 through 20. So this is the story. It's right after Abraham's call. So this is the point where God says to Abram, I want you to lift up, go to a land I will show you, and I'm going to make of you a great nation. Sounds good, right? Sarah goes with him, all the men and women, servants and stuff go with him, and then the very next story is Genesis 12, 10 to 20. So I don't feel a need, well, how about somebody reads it for us?
Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me, he said. Why did you not tell me this was your wife? Why did she say, she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything that he had.
Great story, right? You know, this is the very first story after your call is, hey, now I'm going to tell somebody my wife is my sister and potentially, have her taken as a wife by somebody else. So the questions I have is, what were Abram and Sarah's choices in this story? Let's recognize there's an awful lot of gaps in the story, right? Scripture doesn't give us a word-for-word detail over what decisions were made and how, but they clearly together had to make a couple decisions in the midst of this. So think about what those decisions were. What decisions do you think showed love, and what decisions do you struggle with within that story? I think you should be able to identify some decisions where you'll say, well, there's a matter of love in that. And then there's probably some other decisions where you're like, that was just a bad decision. And then does this story teach us anything about love? So, such
My
an
favorite.
awesome.
Did you know this one?
No.
Yeah, this isn't one we teach kids in Sunday school. We're not, hey, let's talk about the time when one man said that his wife was his sister, so that he wouldn't get killed. So what were their choices in this story?
To either stay in the land of famine or to go somewhere else.
They could have stayed, right?
Yeah.
So
Supposedly.
there's a faith issue here that I think we sometimes miss, which is, so God's kind of set up the covenant already, and all he says to them is, you go, and I'm going to take care of everything else, right? There's no rules. It's not like the Moses covenant where you're given the commandments that you're supposed to follow. It is simply go, I'm going to take care of the rest. And here they are feeling, the very next story is, well, there's a famine here. What do? We're out.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you look back, it says that, when he's there at the tree of Morah in the land of the Canaanites, that's where God appears to Abram and says, to your offspring, I will give this land. So he's thinking, this is where I'm supposed to be, right? And he builds the altar and all of that. Well, of course, in the next verse, he goes a little bit further, builds another altar, so he's,
He builds a lot of altars, by the way.
Right.
So if you read the whole story, seemed like
he's
this
a good
guy,
altar builder.
this guy, maybe it was his profession, because it does seem like every place he stops, he's like, you know what I'm doing here? Building an altar.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure his wife eventually was like, you know what I'm doing here? Building an altar, aren't you? So what other decisions did they have?
Well, the next decision for me is the decision to precipitate the lie or not to.
Yeah, so the lie about Sarah.
Right.
Which it sure reads like they just agreed upon it. It doesn't read like Sarah did this kicking and screaming. It reads like they came to this conclusion that the best way to handle the situation was to lie. Any other decisions in the story?
He lets the king take her to the palace.
Yeah. So now the king has her.
He accepts a bunch of gifts.
Yeah. So he takes the gifts. Which, by the way, is all but selling her to him as wife. Thank you, Abram. And the last choice, which we don't think about often, is God chooses to remain faithful to them in spite of this.
Right.
Right? Because God could have said, I'm going to pick somebody else. Right?
And Pharaoh could have said,
Then
"You know
Abram
what?"
wouldn't be in the Bible.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But God doesn't. It's a definite statement of God's faithfulness, even in the midst of a lack of faith. Right? This is going to become a resounding theme throughout Scripture, right? Even in the New Testament, there's a lot of statements of the disciples were not as faithful to Christ as Christ was to the disciples. That God's faithfulness is steadfast, our faith can waver. So, what decisions do you think showed love in this story? None? You didn't come up with one?
Well, we came up with some, but love between who?
Now, not having read it,
Go along with the
yeah, I mean, for her to
I want to replace
leave her
the word
husband.
love with fear, because this is kind of a story of fear, although I understand and we can attribute love to it, and it comes back to what you said at the very end there, is it's God's love for Abram, that Abram,
That it
Is
turned
it-
out.
I don't
Right.
like how I'm wording this.
but
There's a.
I definitely believe that Pharaoh showed an act of love towards Sarai before he knew who Sarai was.
But isn't Sarai's response a sacrificial love response? I'm willing to take something negative to keep you safe.
Right.
Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say there's a tremendous statement of love from Sarai to Abram.
I don't believe it's reciprocal.
So Abram's love seems a
himself.
little selfish, right? So we talked about that a little bit. Abram's an example of how human love can be selfish, right? And I'm gonna quote love. I don't think this is an example of how you should be, but it is clearly, one of the things I said last week. I think I said this last week was that one of the things that sets Scripture apart from this is that the characters have major flaws. They don't have a flaw, they have major flaws. So Abraham, the father of faith, is a horrible human being at some points, and this is a point where he is, right? I mean, his love is very selfish. His love of Sarah allowed him to put her at risk for having multiple partners so that he can protect himself. Because he wasn't worried about them protecting Sarah, right?
No, he knew she'd be all right.
Yeah, she'd be alright. She'd be married and probably have it even better than she had it with Abraham, right?
Right.
Well,
Because they wouldn't be on the road the
Right.
whole time.
Right, they- she'd have a palace and everything.
no
Man,
more
she
altar
was a
building for me, baby.
So which decisions do you struggle with in the story?
Every one of them.
Definitely the Abram thing, right?
Right, asking his wife. I struggle with Abram taking all of these gifts. I think that's kind of self-serving because we obviously, when we look up above, he's traveling, he's well off, he doesn't need these things.
He already has people and cattle and
Yeah.
camels.
But he accepts more.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I struggle with? It's horrible to say. I struggle that God blessed his horrible decision.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because he does.
Right, he does.
So that idea that God would look at that horrible decision. I'm a behaviorist, right? If my kid does something wrong, I understand the best way to help them learn is what?
Punish.
Negative consequences, right? Punishment. Not, I know you blew it, but I'm giving you more. Right? And yet that's what God did. Now, I think that goes to the God's faithfulness is bigger than our faith thing. So I can accept it from that standpoint, but I still struggle with it a little bit. I still would rather God say, "Hey, I'm going to kill half your animals now so you learn don't do that."
But isn't that also God's way of providing for him, like he promised them they would do?
Yeah, and that's a big part of the faithfulness is the provision, right? That even when he makes stupid decisions, God's still providing for him and above and beyond what he would expect, right? He would have been happy just to get out of Egypt alive, and instead now he's getting out of Egypt with extra stuff. Which, by the way, if you look at it, this whole story mimics what story?
It's
Many
like a prodigal
stories.
son type of thing is what I thought of.
The Exodus story.
Oh, see,
Right?
I thought you do bad things and then you get more. That's the
Well, that's
perfect.
not quite what the prodigal
Yeah.
I
son
know,
does.
that's part of it, that's part of it.
It is a little bit. It is a little bit. But if you look at the Exodus story, there's a famine. They go to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
They're slaved. There's issues there. But
long
when they're
time frame.
released, the Egyptians give them their stuff. We sometimes forget that part of the Exodus story. But so the way it reads in Exodus is it says that they pillaged the Egyptians without the Egyptians really realizing, because the Egyptians were just giving them their stuff. And the same thing happens here. So does this story teach us anything about love?
God's love, faithfulness.
God's faithfulness when he says he was going to be.
So there's a huge statement of God's love, and I'm going to equate that with his faithfulness, right?
No matter what shenanigans we pull.
Yeah.
And for me, this is kind of, in a way, it's the first of many stories.
I don't know how to spell shenanigans, so I'm going to go false.
Okay. Although Adam and Eve last week, I think this is the first of many stories about how God chooses just the normal people like you and me sometimes, and blesses us beyond our own measure, and even when we, in our own faults and failures, don't recognize it.
Would you call this man normal?
He's
This
rich.
man, Abram?
Yes, yes. If that's normal, I wouldn't want to be Colleen.
Yeah, so the next person, the person that comes to mind for me is David, right? Is David normal? Holy,
Yeah.
No,
So I'm gonna say I think he uses
the abnormal?
below average people at some level, because I can't imagine going to my wife. I'm a little afraid here. How about you say you're my sister so that you
Right.
can cover for my skin, right?
Well, I know your wife, she
She would not agree with it either. She doesn't have the same type of love Sarah clearly has.
You don't have the bucks he had either.
Yeah.
Is that true? I don't have the bucks that he has either. So does it teach us anything else about love? I like to be reminded that our love fails sometimes, right? And I think part of the conflict we get into as human beings is we expect other human beings to love us perfectly, and it doesn't happen because we're still selfish. And so, we like the love stories that sit there and act like, well, they're going to walk off into the sunset. You ever watch the Titanic? Mm-hmm. You know what would have happened had he not died on the Titanic?
They've
She'd
gotten mad at each other.
She'd have left him in 2 months, right? He was poor, she was rich. She was used to living a rich lifestyle. What are they going to do when they get onto America and they're poor? She going to hang out with Jack then? Of course not.
There was enough
The guy
room on
had
the
to
door.
die. It's the best ending part of the story.
There was enough room on the door. I'm just saying.
There was enough room on the door, but she knew.
Yeah, but you didn't see Mythbusters.
Yeah.
They'd have both survived.
They'd have both died
Oh,
anyway.
yeah.
But that's irrelevant. So I think the reminder that our love fails is really important, because it's so easy when somebody we love, when their love fails, it's so easy for us to notice that. Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we make selfish decisions in the midst of love as well, and we shouldn't try to act like we are better than we really are in that situation. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. So the next story, so Abraham, when he's called, he's kind of given two promises. He's promised land, and he's promised descendants. Now they're noticing a major problem with number 2, which is he doesn't have any kids. So Abraham and Sarai, being brilliant, they decide, hey, you were promised kids, but you don't have kids, so we're going to solve this problem. And that's what this story is. If somebody wants to read Genesis 16, 1 through 16.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now she's pregnant. She treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abram replied, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit."
Yeah.
Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I am running away from my mistress Sarai," she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." Then he added, "I will give you more descendants than you can count." And the angel also said, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. Therefore, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me." She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Beer Lahai Roi, which means well.
Nailed it.
Huh?
Nailed it.
Perfect.
Oh,
Perfect.
awesome. Which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born.
So perfect, right? They solved the problem.
It still
All is
remains
good.
to this day.
Only one. By the way, your translation missed my favorite part of the whole translation.
Maybe I didn't read it right.
Mine says he was a wild ass of a man.
Oh.
I just, right? You don't get to say that in church all that long. So
And not in
This one
version.
says he will be a wild donkey of a man.
yeah,
That's a lot.
yeah, that's a nice translation, but we all know what it means.
I had a feeling.
So, the questions I have for you to talk about in your smaller groups is who decided to attempt to have a child with a different woman? How do cultural differences lend to this decision? And how about our decisions? As in, do we make decisions that cultural influences clearly would impact? How does Sarah respond after this decision, and is it fair? And what does this story show about love? Who decided to attempt to have the child with a different woman?
Sarah and
Sarah,
Abram.
well, but it's kind of the reverse, right? So in the last story, it talks about how Abram said to Sarah, "I want you to do this, so that this." Now this time, Sarah is coming to Abram and saying, "I want you to do this because." So I think it's kind of flipped a little bit from where we were.
It seems to me it's more Sarah's idea than Abram's,
Mm-hmm.
right? That,
Of course,
that-
he's going, "Okay, whatever you want."
I'm sure he was devastated.
Yes.
Okay. So there's the reason I asked the cultural differencing is sometimes we forget how much culture plays into what we will willingly think about. But back then, the idea that you would take a slave woman
Right.
and have sex with her to produce a child that was for a different woman was just kind of accepted. That was accepted. Today, that you know, that's not even something vaguely on our mind. The example Jim came up with vaguely close would be like a surrogate mother, but it's still very, very different than the way this would happen. So I just think sometimes it's important for us to realize that our cultural differences change our decisions, what seems reasonable a lot. Because if I'm reading this story today, this seems like the least reasonable decision
Right.
you could possibly make, right? I mean, I would
Because
sit
there would
there
be nothing wrong with him having multiple wives.
right.
There was
Right.
nothing wrong with
But it
that.
doesn't make sense to me that I would count a kid born of a different person as somebody else's kid. You know, we don't operate that way without adoption.
You wouldn't count Sydney as my daughter.
I love Sydney. Why wouldn't I?
She's not
Okay,
your
this
daughter.
whole scenario is going to creep me out, so let's just skip on forward after. So
Sydney, your daughter.
after the decision to have Hagar have the baby, how does Sarah respond?
Not so well.
Well, Hagar gets haughty.
That haughty Hagar.
Yes. Because I'm better than you because I can have children.
Yeah,
And Sarah's jealous.
and Sarah's jealous. So was that fair, Sarah?
Hagar started it.
Really? Would you say Hagar starts it?
I don't know.
Who did? Well, if
Sarah
Sarah
starts
doesn't
it.
say have a kid,
Right.
true.
you getting haughty?
That's true.
And then once
Sarah
she's
starts
pregnant,
out-
things kind of go differently.
Was
Sarah starts it out of love, but Hagar starts it out of contempt. Hagar starts the conflict,
yeah.
but Sarah's just doing the decision out of love for Abraham.
I would probably, and this is more opinion than any sort of facting, I would probably blame Sarah just because she initiates the whole convoluted, how do we handle this type of complicated relationship, right?
Without faithfulness.
Right. So you know, the whole story, once again, is a story of a lack of faith, right? God's made a promise. I'm not quite trusting the promise is going to fill out, so I'm going to solve a problem that is my problem, not God's problem, right? But it shows you how, in the midst of love, we can do really convoluted things, right? You can make really convoluted decisions. Certainly Sarah's offer was one of love, right? I mean, we recognize this is the second time in a row. Sarah was willing to put a pretty big sacrifice up there to help Abram. So there's clearly this mark of love. At the same time, Abram doesn't just take anybody for his wife, and he could have. So there is a love there for Sarah that he doesn't share. Now, your translation implied more that this becomes a marriage relationship. I think that was really trying to redeem the relationship a little bit. Because clearly Abram doesn't see this as a marriage relationship. Because when Sarah's upset with Hagar, what does he tell Sarah?
You're a servant.
Right.
Do what you want. You don't do that if it's your
Right.
wife.
That's true.
Right. You don't say do with my other wife whatever you want. He says it's your slave girl. So I think your translation cleans it up an awful lot. Mine just keeps referring to her as, go in and have sex with her, but uses different
Read verse
terminology
3
for the,
from yours.
So that's right.
that might require a turn page.
Sorry.
So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. So it does use the word wife. But I think that when it says took her as a wife, that is the sex count statement.
Yeah.
Because they don't everywhere say they had sex. They always use an allusion to it. It's much nicer to say that, right? So how does this story show love?
Well, Sarai is trying to show love. She's
To?
trying
Abram.
to Abram. And then Hagar, God shows love to Hagar by telling her, go back and don't worry about it because I'm going to take care of
Offspring.
your donkey of a son.
Yes, your donkey was son. Thanks, God.
Also known as Ishmael.
Yeah.
He also promises Hagar descendants, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I read that right.
Yeah, he gives Hagar very much the same promises that Isaac has, as far as your kid's gonna be the father of many nations.
Right.
It's also very much a statement of God's faithfulness in the midst of, once again, our lack of faith, right? Because he doesn't just strike down Hagar, he doesn't strike down Ishmael, he doesn't strike down Abraham or Sarah at this point. He still allows them to persist even though they're clearly stepping away from faith in him. So the story's going to close, actually the story closes with Sarah's death, but we're not going to read that part. The story closes with the fulfillment of the promise. So Abram is called in Genesis 12, and it's not till Genesis 21 that we get to the point where the promise is fulfilled. So I have listed here 1 to 21, but actually we can stop much earlier because we're going to run out of time.
It's a shame because one of the best stories is the 3 visitors. But that's
Yeah.
okay. Oh well.
I stopped before that anyway.
Yeah.
So let's read 1 through 7. Who wants to read?
Carol does.
The Lord, I'm sorry.
No, you do. No.
The Lord blessed Sarah as he had promised, and she became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham when he was old. The boy was born at the time God had said he would be born. Abraham named him Isaac, and when Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Sarah said, should we continue?
Yeah.
God has brought me laughter.
Sarah said, God has brought me joy and laughter. Everyone who hears about it will laugh with me. Then she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.
Okay. So the promise happens, right? The whole thing is fulfilled. But what we're going to find out is it doesn't seem to fix Abraham and Sarah's problem. So I want you to discuss those 3 questions that, just like so many things in life, when a problem gets fixed, does it fix everything? And then what's the response toward Hagar? You have to read a little further, actually, but we'll read in our groups. What does the response toward Hagar and Ishmael show us? Because there's going to be a separation now between the families. And how does this story speak about love? So could you imagine having a kid at 100? I can't. I'm 42. I would not want a newborn in my household. Like
My
at
friend
100,
had-
no way. I want a newborn.
My friend and his wife are like 41, 42, and they just had a baby.
Yeah.
What about the lady in Germany that just had in vitro?
Her grandchild.
See, this is why I
Right.
can't get myself off topic, because now we're talking about a lady in Germany that had in
She's
vitro.
65 years
Yeah.
old and she's going to have triplets.
Yeah, that's nuts. So now that the promise is fulfilled, does it solve their problems?
No, there's still unhappiness.
What's unhappiness stem from, though?
Sarah's,
Trying to make a plan that
right.
wasn't God's plan.
So they're still suffering from their faulty
Right.
choices, right?
Yes, Sarah and Hagar are still butting heads.
At some level, the choices are almost exasperated now because you have two kids. You know, instead of just dealing with the one kid,
Right.
now you have a second kid. And what's the response toward Hagar and Ishmael show us? And there's a couple people responding to Hagar and Ishmael there, right?
That Sarah's not happy with them.
Yeah. Sarah still has some jealousy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Abraham
loves him. He definitely loves Ishmael because he's a son.
Yeah, but who's he love more?
Sarah.
Sarah, right? This is the first story where Abraham is willing to make a sacrifice for her instead of she's making the sacrifice for him, right? Because he clearly doesn't want to let Ishmael go.
Right.
He does it very
Because she-
reluctantly,
right.
but to keep Sarah happy. It also shows God's love for them all, right? Because he doesn't abandon Hagar and Ishmael. You know, he could have. He could have left them to their own devices, but he does not. He provides for them. If you read far enough, you see that, you know, he provides from water and safety, so they don't have that concern. If you've ever been to that area of Israel, it would be kind of scary and awful if you were stuck out there for any length of time, because there's no water.
It's kind of like South Texas.
Yeah, probably. Probably. And then how does this story speak about love?
I think it's the same as we talked the other 2 times. It's God's love for us. It's
He's
that faithful. Because no matter how hard we try, Abraham screws it up, Sarah screws it up, Hagar screws it up, Ishmael screws it up. And the only person that remains faithful is God.
It also shows us that, Chris said this, I like though, that love is messy, right?
I speak from experience on that.
Do you try to own that?
Love is messy.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
It is, and it's, you know, sometimes we pretend that love is as clean and just always wonderful and, you know, oogly googly, and, you know, if you ever watch The Notebook, that's kind of how it ends with it. And I'm always like, oh, that's very rarely what it is. You know, it's messy, and a big part of why it's messy is because we're faulty. Right? Because we make bad choices, and sometimes we act like I get to make that bad choice, and then I say I'm sorry, and there's no more consequences, right? But that's not true, right? I mean, because they're going to pay all through their lives for the choice with Sarah and Hagar, right? That choice keeps raising its head. But in the midst of the messy love, what do? they push forward, right?
They stick.
They stick
stick
with
it
it. And so the story I didn't have you read is when Sarah dies, you know, women are so dreadfully neglected in the Old Testament, right? You would hardly know they exist. You know what Noah's wife's name is?
Nope.
Nobody knows what Noah's wife's name is because nobody cares about Noah's wife, right? But Sarah here, she's named, she's involved in the stories, and then at the very end when she dies, it talks about Abraham's great grief, how hard it was for him to lose Sarah. So even though their relationship wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, their commitment to each other really stays strong throughout. So in the midst of messy love, they push forward, and I think that's really cool. I think it's really cool that you know, we don't have a father of the faith that has this perfect love story that can intimidate us for the fact that our love stories can be kind of messy, but instead we have a father of faith that has all these faults, but God keeps pursuing him, and he keeps staying with his wife, and eventually, you know, they get to inherit the title as kind of the first family of faith, right? I mean, everyone knows Sarah's name, even though she's not exactly where Abraham is, you know Sarah's name. That's not true with a lot of women in the Bible, right? I mean, Noah's wife, not named. Adam's named, and then Eve comes along, and it's the woman for 2 chapters before, you know, Adam gets to name her, and you know there's a little issues with that. So you know this is one of those stories that to me says love is messy, God is faithful, and you can stick with it to the end. Anyone have any final thoughts or questions or comments? So the next story is going to be really messy because it's Isaac, and if you don't know the story of Isaac, who becomes not Isaac, Jacob, who becomes Israel. I get the 2 I names confused.
Right.
And what we find out is he actually marries 2 women, has one that he clearly favors over the other. Slave girls get involved all over again, and yet this is the tribe of Israel, right? This is where
All the tribes.
This is yes, all the tribes of Israel.
All 12 of them.
Israel's a busy man.
Yeah.
So we'll go over that in a lot of what that says about love, and we're going to see very resounding themes, which is love can be messy, but that God is still faithful. And for us, I think that's a great, always a great reminder that in the midst of my messy love, in the midst of the times I failed, I believe God is still very strongly with us. Adam, would you close us in prayer? Sure.